creating some type of incentive for sustainability that is equitable on both sides of the value chain is going to be the one that's going to win.
Welcome to the GOAT Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Cassinan. At GOAT, we define sustainability through the lens of intentionality, circularity, and community. With this framework, any problem can be solved. The stories that we share, the pioneers that we talk to, show us a different way to build the future we all want to have.
We're at a pivotal moment where nuclear is needed more than ever. Let's once and for all become a circular economy.
Waste is not cost neutral. Like, it always costs your business something. So if you can get rid of that, then that's good for business as well.
There's this dissonance. We talk a really good game about protecting the ocean, but the purchase decisions that we make don't match with our espoused values.
An ideal food system revolves around relationship. Where is my food coming from? Who's growing it? How is it being grown? And why does that matter?
Thanks for being here. Let's dive into the conversation. Before you got in with the Apparel Impact Institute or Cradle to Cradle, all of that, where did your kind of interest in, whether it be supply chain or apparel or textiles, where did all of that come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've been thinking about that and pondering it a lot too. How did I get into the fashion sector? And a lot of it for me came out of I always sort of follow the areas that are interesting to me, and I think you're accurate. This is a very interesting sector to be able to share storytelling to the masses in the same way that art and theater and music, and it's a way in which we brand ourselves. We communicate, we tell our stories based on the choices we made or make when it comes to what we wear. And when people are oftentimes, inclined to say, I'm not into fashion, you're like, yeah, but are you wearing clothes? And then you look, they're like me right now, Patagonia pullover, maybe a Lululemon shirt. Like, I'm making a statement about who I am, like a middle-aged dad. No, I'm making a statement, in some way. I'm communicating something about me that you can read, like, oh, this guy's that, or this guy, tomorrow, then I can wear a different look and a different feel and, and tell a different story. But I think for me, I started my career in art history, and I thought that I was going to go on and be a curator at the Met or National Gallery or something, because I love this very thing, which is that as humans, we tend to embed the stories of our culture in things and objects. And the best way to understand a culture or a community is to explore their things, right? And whether that's, again, art, clothing, home furnishings, technology and equipment, sporting equipment, like all this reflects the times in which we live. You go to a new museum and you see artifacts or art from 2000 years ago. That's how we understand their cultures, through these things, right? So I got into that work, but then I realized I had a lot of smart, intuitive business skills without the background and training. So I went and got an MBA, and so like the two coupled together kind of became the fertile ground for ultimately taking me into this area, which I can tell you a lot more about how I think that pulled through, and I found myself doing sustainability in fashion. But that's kind of like the origin story of like my interest in with business. Then the sector, eventually apparel started showing up in my life in various ways, and that I got pulled into that.
What was it about art history? Because I find that interesting. I love the idea of how art impacts culture. I mean, I think it's one of the drivers that most people don't pay attention to. And we'll focus a little bit more on, the technology or the engineering or the application or the business growth. But art is always that thing that stays consistent. What was it about art for you when you were younger?
I think for me it was that, I've always been a very visual person. Even when I'm like trying to communicate in business, I need to whiteboard it or draft it, or when we're having a team meeting, I'll be like, okay, I see it like this. You got this and this, or here's the Venn diagram and that's in the middle. And like, I use my hands a lot. And so this idea of being a very visual person who was drawn to, um, object, visual art objects. And also I love history, and I feel that the context of humanity, we can learn so much if we about who we are and where we're going if we first understand where we came from and what we've done before, and that the best context for creating systems change is to understand the other systems we've been part of and where we have already transitioned systems. Art is amazing for that. And particularly, I got drawn into 20th century art, pop art, like, which was so, that was the 60s and 70s were a very disruptive time in the world. We're in another extremely disruptive in the time in the world. So looking to see how that's being communicated by the seers, and the seers may come in the form of graffiti artists or rap musicians or R&B or fashion designers. Those may be the people that we look to tell us, here's who you are today, here's who you think you are, and here's who you're not saying you are but who you actually are. Look to art, all forms of it.
Yeah. When I was younger, I took a class, and it was on counterculture, which I thought was so interesting that it was a course, and it had to do with the Beat Generation, whether that was music in jazz, whether that was the writing of Jack Kerouac, and all of the rebels, so to speak, of that same time period, and then how that further influenced the way that we actually do everything now. I mean, it's the idea of free thought, and can you just have a little bit more leeway in what you're doing? Like jazz specifically was like one of the big things for me, because when you look at Beat Generation jazz, it was like they had their chorus that they wanted to run with, but always in the middle, each artist would get their own time to just do literally whatever they wanted to. And somehow they knew how to kind of come back together. And, people viewed it as chaotic, and they were like, this is wildly a departure from what music should be. But it actually enhanced music. And people didn't see that till later.
Totally. Two things that come to mind for me about that are the Salon de Refusé in Paris in the 19th century. All the art that got rejected from the art museums because they were modern, right? And now we look back at Manet, particularly like Mannerism and Manet, and be like, that seems so mainstream art. That's not cutting edge stuff that would come later. That's 19th century, like later in 20th century. But even like pointillism and impressionism and breaking away the forms and the shapes and the colors, the fauve artists like Matisse and everyone in that category, and Seurat. And, you start to think about those movements were so revolutionary. And now a very conservative mainstream person looks at that as very conservative mainstream art. The other one was when we talk about counterculture, and here I am sitting in the Bay Area of California, where so much counterculture was. You mentioned the beat movement a lot, New York, but then you've got the West Coast version of it in the 50s and 60s as our country was heading to revolution, cultural revolution, as well as some other types of revolution. And I think about places like Esalen Institute and Big Sur, which were focused on the evolution of human potential. And they were having these early conversations in the late 1950s around, we know humanity evolves, so therefore we must still be evolving. Where are we going? Let's explore the counter, and understand. And a lot of that fringe was like ancient philosophy and practice, like meditation, breathing, yoga. Now I can walk into Walmart and Target and buy a kit on breathing, meditation, and yoga and download it on an app from Apple. So it's mainstream, but 60, 70 years ago, that stuff was considered, whoa, what do you mean you're doing yoga? You must be some kind of communist.
I find that so interesting about the West Coast, because I'm originally from Santa Cruz, so Bay Area, same kind of thought process. And when you look at like the technology movement, even of the 2010s, it was like this, it was the same type of, break it and see what happens mindset, as it applied to technology. And I think that there's specific areas of the world that I find are always thinking a little bit progressively. whether that is in the business sector, whether that is just as a personal thing. The fact that you know Esalen Institute, I think is wonderful because I mean, Big Sur is a magical area. I lived in Monterey for like a year and a half, and it was oh, what a place. I mean, there's something about the natural environment too that I think that area offers. Whereas if you have that time to kind of relax and settle into it, there's something cool about it that I feel like it's hard to put a finger on, but it actually inspires a lot of that progressive thought.
Well, as I understand it, a lot of our indigenous people out here on the West Coast understood that about Big Sur and that area where you had the hot sulfur springs meeting with the cold Pacific Ocean, and there were a lot of dichotomies of nature and things that we've forgotten. Those of us that are modern, walking in modern streets with modern cars and all this technology buzzing around us, like we're so out of touch with our relationship to nature. But whenever I'm down in that area and I need to get back down to Esalen in particular, it's been a while. I feel big shifts in my, if I can quiet down enough, to really experience whatever it is I'm supposed to be witnessing or experiencing while I'm there, I get big shifts. And usually that comes in the form of just getting quiet enough to listen to like maybe what I should be working on or what I should not be working on. And it is that part that gets back to your first question around like what was it about art. It's this, I have this resonating phrase which I know that David White the poet said it, but he was probably paraphrasing somebody else, and it's that which does not bring you to life is too small for you. So always looking for those um, things that bring us to life, those uh, career moments, those relationship moments, those curiosity around a music or an art form or a literature or a historical reference or whatever. When we get those, like, ooh, that we want to lean into it, it's bringing us alive. That's probably where we're supposed to be focusing our energy and our time, because you're being called into that thing that uniquely invites you to have a relationship. And it's different for you than it is for me. Right. And so that's how, you know, like, how do you know what you're supposed to do with your life? Just lean into those feelings. Right.
I oftentimes, when somebody asks me, hey, what should I do? Like I'm in this weird impasse. I don't know what I want to do, and um, this isn't always the answer, but it's something to pay attention to. I'm like, what's the thing that you sit down for 2 hours, and then you look up and it's been 6? What was that thing? Because it may not be exactly that thing, but there's something about that kept your attention for so long that time almost melted away, and you were just so engaged in that thing, and that's that lean in process. How do you kind of navigate that? I mean, and this is where I think we can get a little bit into the Apparel Impact Institute, of course, but how do you lean into that as, kind of leading an organization? I think you have this weird, almost like middle ground that you have to hit between, we're reaching for these goals that fit in this society, and then we have this other shift of like, I think it should go this direction.
Yeah. It's challenging. And I said early on, well, no, I said this in a conversation I had before this one about, I used to think that as the leader of an organization, I was supposed to have all the answers and all the strategy, and that everyone was looking to me for that. And I've come to realize that's not the case at all. But that sometimes if I quiet myself down enough, I may be able to see or hear something that others may not be seeing or hearing. And I don't think I'm unique. It's just maybe I'm just able to get quiet enough to understand it. But the reality is, and this is going to get a little woo woo, but there's no exact science to what we're doing, which is systems change and evolution of like how humanity lives on the planet and how we make our things and live with our stuff and all these things that are creating positive and negative impact in so many ways, right? They're building world economies, but at the same time, they're also taking natural resources. And so you've got this whole thing. And for me, the ability to sort of sense the creative part of this and then be able to interpret that into implementation and business drivers and objectives and key results, and then work with the staff and a team and to build that up and to resource it. And also to ensure that you're going fast enough to actually be moving the needle, but not too fast to crash the ship. And it's really important because I think as passionate advocates of issues like social and environmental problems we're trying to solve on the planet, we feel like we're always way behind and we're falling short. And the issue is so big, we just have to go faster. And the reality is, we have to go slow to go fast. Sometimes it's like get real clear and then go through. And I rely on my team a lot to inform me on how to operationalize some of the stuff that I'm sensing and bringing down. And I've learned more and more, particularly over the last decade, I think, to get better at my own discernment. Like, this is a great idea that needs to be parked, or this is a great idea that won't yet work in the strategies for where things are today. And in this particular sector, um, a lot of what we have to do is going to change the way this business works. And that's hard because you're going up against one side of the business that is built on a capitalist model, that is an extractive model of human and environmental resources. And then you have this other force of having the courage to know that status quo isn't going to get us there. And we've got to be able to and I think it's courage, the courage to be able to say, yes, and let's lean into what's the right answer for systems change, right? Because if we all just stay in the safe, we're going to do a bunch of pilot projects and they're going to sound cool, but they're never going to be part of the core business. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but I think when you posed it, I was like, there's a lot in here. And it is that challenge of being able to balance the differences between where we're going and then sequencing it to get there. Um, and I'll kind of end with my former CEO when I was at the Mohawk Group, part of Mohawk Industries. Al Cabas said to me years ago, like, "You, Lewis, you're a visionary, and yet to be in corporate, you're going to have to dole this out like 5% at a time, or you're just going to like crash and burn." And I think about that a lot when I think about the sustainability people, but even the CFOs and some of these fashion brands that I get to know and work with, that a lot of them know where they're going, but they also have shareholders and they have family members and they have they have the market in general, they have the asset owners of their stock, and they have to sequence this change in a way that they don't get ousted off the throne and then get replaced by the guy or girl that doesn't really care about sustainability, right? So if they're passionate, they're like, how do I sequence this in a way that it actually can be adopted and in a level of speed that maintains our leadership and moves us in the right direction, but doesn't crash the ship, right?
Ah, that's so important because it's almost the narrative that I think Goat had in the beginning. Realistically, like the way that I see the systems that we can change and how we can change it. I remember when I first was pitching investors, the feedback that I got, the biggest feedback on was, you're trying to boil the ocean, and it was like it was consistent, and it was like, but I'm not. It's just one step at a time, but let's get there. But it's that realization that, like, you actually have to dose it out at 5%, 5%, 5%, knowing that that's the end goal, but like knowing what is achievable in that moment, because there are stakeholders along the way. And when you think about, oftentimes, like the bigger companies, you have a lot of demand for immediate change, almost light switch change, and that literally can't happen because there is so much that needs to move. The bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is this idea of a patient urgency. It's like, yes, we understand there's an urgency, but you can't just go into this panic state of just like going quickly, because and one of the things I have mentioned is that, like, plastic wasn't actually a bad thing. Plastic was a great thing. It actually did so much for the world positively. Um, we just didn't do a lot on the end life cycle of it, second use. I mean, there was no thought around the other side. And so had we been a little bit more patient, we may have come around a little bit more. And that's where I think about, specifically the apparel industry and the fashion industries. It's wildly exciting from a design standpoint. I think the textiles and everything that we're living through right now is absolutely incredible. Like we have the wild opportunities, yet you have a business model that needs shifting because it's kind of been status quo for a very, very long time. And for good reason. It's a very mature business at this point. I mean, if you think about apparel from, 50 years ago, the business model was not refined at all. And now it's so much more refined. And so it's harder to shift that once it's a refined system. How do you approach it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question because I think that you're right. I want to acknowledge that a lot of the best innovations of systems, of process, of product and material have been done with the best of intention, right? They're like, this is amazing. The Industrial Revolution, the creation of plastics for all kinds of products, and all the usages of these petroleum based materials that can do so many cool, amazing things, right? And then the list goes on and on. We could sit here and rattle off, dozens of things that are created great efficiencies and wealth and better products and better medical care and better, you know, empowerment to humans in general. A lot of great tools, technology being one of them. But the shadow side is we don't always know what's coming, right? We don't always know what we the unintended consequences of the things we're building and creating, particularly when they get to scale. AI, social media, fast fashion, like when things get to, or just, I don't even like to call it fast fashion. It's just fashion. And honestly, it's just the speed of it. You've got affordable fashion, you've got, mid price, you've got luxury, you're squeezing margins across different ones in different ways. It's just like, but some of them are faster than others, but honestly, they're all similar in a lot of ways. And you look at how to approach this industry and systems change, which is again back to what I said earlier, is we've got to demonstrate that money can be made and will be made for this future of this industry, which means diversifying the business models on all sides, right? Like what is product, what is brand, so you're starting to see experience and hospitality and lifestyle and all these, so like what are all these product extensions that may not rely on just this thing being made that I want to replace in 6 months or get another one next year at Christmas or whatever, so that if the brand is not reliant on solely the selling of that object, but it has other value for society and value for humanity, then you can monetize that in ways that also creates value across all shareholders and stakeholders, including those who are the shareholders, and then also starting to look at who the other shareholders should be, which is participants in the value chain from the supply chain up, right? And I think that's a big part of equitable wealth distribution across a lot of these companies. We start to look at honoring, acknowledging who's making our clothes and honoring the value of them within the creation of the wealth, which is also going to change the model as well too. So there's so many elements to this that we have to be looking at, but the reality is that all of them are going to have to accelerate. And so picking the ones that can scale faster, sooner, I think is kind of the place we're in right now, in this industry. And at the same time, not shutting the door on what fashion does really well, which is experimentation, and allowing that experimentation, which oftentimes might be the leading press release, right? The coolest thing is not the wonky thing that you're scaling because it makes sense and it's ready to scale. The coolest thing is the cutting edge. Back to that, the edge of the culture, the fringe of design, the beginning of it, and that's where things get really cool. So I find that approaching all of this work, whether it's us working on decarbonization in the supply chain or the designer working on what's the next generation of designs that's going to really increase brand heat, is being the ability to understand what's working, and the ability to have that futurist look at what's coming next, and have this front burner, back burner relationship where you're stirring the pots and bringing things forward too.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned that I think is really important is the scale. When you look at business systems and infrastructures when they scale, that's where some big holes end up coming up. What is it about the scalability process? Like, and I'm not trying to name names here, but like if you just take Allbirds as an example. Allbirds, fantastic business model, alternative materials, let's do this. Then they scaled hardcore. Arguably, their quality went down. To me, that is like a natural, well, when you get to scale, it's the product can't be as good. Similar to like coffee and Starbucks. They can't physically get small crops of beans because of the volume of beans they're doing. So they have to over roast the beans that they make in order to make the product consistent. What does that look like in the apparel industry when you look to actually scale?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I can answer it from the side of leadership too, because I believe that one of the biggest challenges that companies have, organizations have, um, individuals have, is going from your early stage to your mid to your late stage, or in the case of like an innovation, it's your pre-seed, pilot, model, and scale phases, right? And as you start off young, you have the ability to have your brain and your eyes and your hands on everything. And I think that quality of process, of product, of relationship, of staffing, of all those things are just easier to manage when there's the scope is small, right? And there's a certain energy to the startup that attracts a certain kind of person. And oftentimes, the startup team or the startup energy can effectively make the journey to the late stage. And that's why you see, in Silicon Valley, it was like the adult in the room, right? Like where the venture capitalists would like fire the founder, but put them in some side position and bring in a seasoned executive who was 10 or 15 years older who could actually grow the company from, you know, pre-seed pilot to model to scale, early, mid to late stage, right? And so I think that being able to be a leader who also is good at early stage and startup and development is to have the humility and the patience and the intelligence to seek out your own opportunities for growth and being able to go on that journey. So you take Allbirds for example, and I haven't worked with Allbirds and don't know the team that intimately, although I know great people over there working on sustainability. But I think that and they would answer this question, I'm sure, very differently than me from the outside or you from the outside. But I do think that quality assurance across relationship, product, relationship to your suppliers, all that, it just changes. And even as I look at our own growth at AII, which we've tripled in the last, year and a half in terms of size, budget, and that's amazing. But it comes with, more process in place to ensure that we're communicating, that we're connected, that we're operating from agreements, that we all are sharing the same objectives, and the key results line back up to those objectives, which point to the mission, and then we'll operate from agreements around those things. So all this kind of languaging and platforming and things that we're building in are necessary for our growth. And without those, we're still operating in startup mode when it's really easy when there's just a handful of people, because you can kind of one or two people can butt heads and figure it out and sort it out and move forward. But when you've got a whole business unit that's butting heads with another whole business unit, the culture starts to collapse and all that.
Hmm. Well, and when you start to look at supply chains, I mean, for the apparel industry, they're usually massive. Like there's so many steps involved. When you can't have your hands on everything, how do you start to manage that process?
Yeah. Yeah, and I haven't been a sourcing person inside corporate. I've been a sustainability person inside corporate and had to work with manufacturing, but for a company that was vertically integrated, so that was a different sector. But I can say that I think that the effectiveness of managing it is all about also having the strength of relationship and establishing the culture of those relationships that you have with your suppliers, that you have with your partners, and the strongest I think companies, and they're getting stronger now from the brand retailer side, are the ones that are really leaning into those supplier relationships, which ultimately is going to have the biggest impact on all of this work. Because when an organization like ours is going to a facility, a factory, a farm, and saying these are the improvements you need to take on, and some of them are low hanging fruit, and they'll you know create efficiencies where you save money, and some of them you're going to actually have to spend some money on because they're going to require some new technologies, some new equipment, maybe some new training. And without the incentive coming from the relationship between the brand retailers who are sourcing those products to the suppliers that are making and creating those, let alone their suppliers, right? Because, the direct supplier is getting their yarn from somewhere, they're buying their dyes from somewhere, they're buying their cotton, it's all trickled up. Like you said, it's a very complicated 4-tier stage, depending on how you cut and slice it. It's a multi-tiered stage. And so, what I'm observing is that the brand retailers that are leaning into those relationships and creating some type of incentive for sustainability that is equitable on both sides of the value chain is going to be the one that's going to win. And it's hard because what does that actually mean? It means that you have a line of sight as a supplier that I'm going to still be working with you in 6 months or 6 years. I mean, what can that timeline look like? Or that you're incentivized to co-invest in some of my innovation or help secure some of the loans that I may be, taking on as a result. What AII is trying to do is also move that into a collaborative so that it's not just reliant on one brand retailer and their supplier, because they may only be 5% volume in that supplier anyway. But if we can bring together 40 to 50 brand retailers in that region across a shared supply chain, this web that's like intermeshed, woven together, then you've got this sort of stabilizing production in that region or country by a significant portion of the industry who sources there, right? And then things start to change, but it's all going to come, I think, with deeper level of partnership and engagement. So to get back to your question, I think that's what differentiates companies that are growing well is that ability to start recognizing that without stronger long-term relationships, the future proofing of their business is a little bit siloed and isolated in corporate strategy and not actually implemented across their partners.
When you look at the finance side of things, I think that a lot of the thought process is that sustainability is a sacrifice or that it's a liability. That why would we take the risk? Because if it doesn't work, it's going to hit our bottom line. I like to believe that there's a case for sustainability actually being profitable. Like I think that it can be an asset rather than a liability. Or is that what you guys are kind of seeing in building the infrastructure correctly?
Yeah, because if you think about it, and what I like to do is jump to the end of the story, or at least the next milestone of the story: total decarbonization, total systems change, efficient, effective, clean tech, clean energy, fair wage, production, right? Fair living wage, human rights. Like, what is that gonna look like? And just imagine ourselves into that future, and then you're taking the next 20 to 30 years back stepping toward that, and that is a profitable system because it's a system at scale too, where the cost of technology has been brought down to be in parity to the either immediate cost, the direct costs, but also the externalities, right? So there's a lot of risk that's not being carried by the brand retailer related to climate, related to water health, related to human health in those regions where the externalities of those costs are just buried somewhere else, or they're impacting other bottom lines, and most of them not yet identified, right? So that's all coming. And I think that the key, really around the finance of all this is to look to industries that have invested in the future, industries that are dependent on being on the cutting edge of the future, that are actually will cease to exist if they're not first to market with technology for the future, tech, space. Maybe we could add automobile to that. Now there are many decades where automobile didn't stay that innovative, but now we're in this whole new space of like innovation around transportation. So if we look at those in the fashion industries, I think there is an embedded cost in the beginning of the development of our future that will be brought down as economies of scale take over, right? Just like a flat screen TV, which 10, 15 years ago was $1,500, and I just bought one with my parents for $299. This big huge TV. Now, should it be that cheap? That's a whole other sector. We'll dissect their margins later. But in our sector, yeah, it can be affordable and it can be brought down, over time. But it means that the whole industry has to signal the market towards the direction of investment in clean tech and clean energy and clean production and efficiency and wellness and workers and all that. And if the whole industry makes that decision to signal the market in that direction, de-risk and create demand for that future, the rest of the financial institutions and capital markets just fall right into place to, capitalism scales. Let's get in. Let's get in on this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is more of I guess, like a consumer question, but when you start to look at the market of how consumers actually shop, you have background with Cradle to Cradle certification, more so specifically. Is it the certification that actually gets people to kind of be like, okay, behavior change? Or with kind of what you guys are doing at AI, it's more like this is just the business infrastructure and the consumer doesn't even have to think about it. They're going to buy the product anyway. And then it's already baked in. Which one is kind of.
That's very interesting because what AII is doing and what Cradle to Cradle did are not that different, actually, in a lot of ways, because Cradle to Cradle would require you to take on improvement in your production and in the formulation of your product. The materials going into it, but oftentimes we think of Cradle to Cradle as just that upcycle recyclability component, but that was material reuse was one category, right? We had renewable energy, clean water stewardship, social and labor, and yeah, material health. Did I get all those? Yeah. So you're looking at this whole strategy by the rating system. As you went from basic, bronze, silver, gold to platinum certification, you were improving your business and then getting verified at milestones to say, yep, you've reached this level, third party verification. Now start working on the next level up. And by design, you were supposed to be booted from the system if you didn't grow every 2 years up the ladder, knowing that some of the higher levels of the standard also couldn't yet be achieved because they were so aspirational that your sector might not actually be able to achieve that yet, just based on everything that currently exists, like clean energy grids and all that. I mean, it would be tremendously expensive to do all on-site solar just to get your Cradle to Cradle certification across your supply chain. But so plugging into the transformation of the grid is a lot more long-term, systemically sustainable and lower cost, right? So then you got AII, who's going into facilities and farms, next farms, but now facilities, and bringing solutions. And then you're supposed to progressively grow till you hit the ding, 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 decarbonized, and you have, a decarbonized system, and then all the other water, land use, biodiversity, all these other KPIs that are kind of leading. Similar thing. So from the consumer perspective, because by the way, we could link those two, and ultimately tech and AI probably will link all this stuff, and one is verifying the other, and one is the improvement process and the finance to get there, and the other one is the actual certification that then tells you did it, and you present it to the world. So But from the consumer perspective, I think it's hard to say what is the bigger driver is, the transparency of the work that's being done or the certification that you trust some third party tells you that it did get done versus just regulation. And then you don't even have to worry about it. Like all this stuff as consumers and citizens that we don't even know that is or isn't in our product because somebody passed a law, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, or whatever. And particularly if you look outside the US and you look at regulation in parts of the world that are more strict than the US when it comes to some of the things we're trying to regulate for sustainability. But that ultimately to me is the pathway, regulation, policy, and then the third party verification of the data sets that say you actually are compliant with that regulation or policy. The consumer, and this is my opinion based on working in this space for, if I go back to even some of the early work I was doing in corporate social responsibility 20 something years ago. Um, it's my opinion, because you can find a report to substantiate any perspective on the consumer's point of view on this because consumers don't care all the way to consumers extremely care. But there's too much information and the consumer doesn't trust. It's about trust. And so to me, verification can be a certification scheme or a standard or a seal or a mark. Verification can be, a third party system, an audit system, or something like that. But ultimately, the consumer is going to need to know that they can trust this statement or this mark. And we can borrow from some of the regulation around languaging from food and ag around organic or regenerative or sustainable, around natural, all natural, bio based, same with like, the way that we compostable versus biodegradable. Like we're going to have to start to actually regulate what the marketing of all this is so the consumer can know how to compare these buzz phrases and does that actually mean anything. So I think that's the next piece of this that's coming is in order for the consumer to make informed decisions and then decide what they trust, there's going to have to be a system to regulate the trust of the conversation that we're having, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest parts of it. I mean, I was at some of the original meetings where, they were really trying to promote regenerative organic, and some of the discussion was, look, people are still confused around organic. Like there's so much consumer confusion, and even I used to work in coffee, and the coffee supply chain is it's crazy. And also when you start to actually look at, there's a difference between coffee farms that are operating organically and ones that are organic certified. The difference literally is, can they afford to actually get the certification versus they're operating exactly the same. And so I think sometimes the certification industry makes it difficult for one end of it, but helps the other end of the consumer to know that they can trust the process along the way.
Totally. And having run a certification program with Cradle to Cradle, what I believe is democratizing a lot of these standards in a way that makes it also affordable to do the assessment and certification work is going to be how these things scale, like really scale. Because right now, yeah, the cost of certification, and then it's flavor of the week. Like if you're in Germany, maybe these are the three important ones. But if you're also selling in France and the US, then you got to tag on these three others. And so the amount of resources that go into paying for all that work, let alone staffing the relationships to you got to have a whole team to manage all your relationships to all the certifications, the paperwork, the submissions, and you have a third party consultant who maybe advises you on it. And it's like, the business of all that will probably get made efficient, lower cost, and therefore more scalable through technology, um, and even AI, right? Where you can model out a lot of this stuff and then just kind of say, this, we know enough to feel confident enough in the data sets that we have, and then model that out against the size of the business and say, we've probably achieved our goals, right?
How are you guys looking to integrate technology into what you guys do at AI? I mean, a part of that is really bringing a lot of these brands into the future. I think that's one of the biggest advantages they could have.
Absolutely. And, embedded in sort of the origin and the DNA of why AAI is the relationship to the facility environmental module under the Higg Index. And so, if you look at the fact that we were launched by a group of brand retailers who wanted to work together on improving the performance or environmental performance or reducing the negative environmental performance or impact of their shared supply chain, right? So rather than one of us try to tackle this, let's all tell the suppliers to do the same things, and then let's get a data report on the back end that verifies they actually did it by tracking units of electricity, carbon, water, chemicals that were reduced, and or the increase of clean water stewardship, renewable electricity, et cetera. So it's like, scaling up the good, scaling down the bad, and then sharing a report on it. So when we launched, we had taken on the mill efficiency work and had a mill improvement alliance that was created with our now own program, Clean by Design, which was launched by the NRDC, alongside other leading programs for efficiencies in the dyeing and finishing of fabrics, wet processing, because that's where most of the environmental impact is happening. I'm happy to dig down into that. But so as a result, we needed to collect data to be able to say to the brand retailer who was pooling resources alongside other brand retailers across those 100 factories in that region that AII would be going into, that we could produce back a report and share that with you. And when you're only working in a couple dozen or 100 or plus, facilities, you can use good old Excel spreadsheets. But ultimately, the ability for that data to go back into the Higg Index, into the facility module, or other, that we would be able to API that data into a brand retailer's, own systems, or the suppliers could share it, because ultimately it's their data. So the suppliers could share it with whomever they wanted to, right? And to create a system that was able to scale, again, as we're talking about scalability, would need to go beyond that. And so what we started building out in the last year and a half is our climate solutions portfolio platform. And on one level, it's the repository of all the data being collected and all of the supply chain partners that we are optimizing their performance, and we're taking measurements and readings and verifying that along the journey. Ultimately, could it all be cloud-based data that goes directly into real time? Amazing. That would be great. Ultimately, could it be modeled out through AII? I don't know. I need to speak to an expert on that. But but the reality is, we know that there's a need to be able to capture this, particularly since a lot of the resources that we're pulling through our Fashion Climate Fund are intended to provide data to achieve your science-based targets that you can report back to the Science Based Targets Initiative. So building out that platform has been important, but then it also potentially has the opportunity to act intelligently to make recommendations to facilities based on key data points about their production, what equipment they're using, their energy and water bills, all the data points that could be extracted from how it's performing, some of which is coming out of Higg, other data sets they could be providing, and the ability to analyze that and then say, based on this, here are the solutions, the technologies, the capital expenditures that you may need to take on in your facility, as well as the access to finance to get there, with more than one financial partner who's willing to come in and provide this, with maybe a third party subsidy to that to be able to lower the cost, right? So that's what we're building now, which is the moving beyond just the brand retailer being able to get an impact report on the 150 factories in China that they just optimized over the last 18 months, and moving into something that's a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more intelligent towards matchmaking suppliers to solutions to money and vice versa, right? And giving banks, financial institutions, development banks, philanthropists, government funds the ability to crowd in faster to the need where it exists. And that's something ultimately the tech platform should be able to do as we build it out. And it follows all the work streams we're building. And so operationalizing that through technology is going to be key. particularly because I can't meet all the facilities in the world, and I have a team, of close to 30 now who also can't meet them all. And I don't really want to scale up to be an organization that has tens of thousands of people out knocking on doors and supply chains. So the ability for us virally to grow where they know about us through local manufacturing associations, local partnerships, their brands are recommending it, and being able to plug into our system, never have to talk to a staff person at AII, but be able to extract value for their environmental sustainable journey, or and be able to bring, these are the solutions to implement, here's the money to get there, and never touch a staff person is great. And if they need us, then obviously you set up the system to be able to connect with humans who can help, because we do have on the ground people. So I'm speaking a little bit about long-term vision for this, but it's being built now by the brand retailers that are part of um, our fashion climate fund. So the lead partners plus Farfetch and Ralph Lauren have been part of that development too. So Lululemon, H&M Group, Target, PVH, as well as Farfetch and Ralph Lauren. And we invite the whole industry to participate in this. So building out the business model for this to have it be a value add to the industry, not just the brand retailers, but they seem to be the ones that are incentivized to start funding and get behind the development of this kind of tool. But ultimately, as we look at bringing in other partners and creating a revenue stream to make sure it sustains itself without having to raise sponsorship dollars or development dollars over and over again from brands to keep it running.
What's the what's the biggest lever that you guys are pulling right now? So I mean, when you look at the manufacturing process, it's you have the sourcing of material, you have the processing of material, you have the dyeing of the material, you have the water-based material, you have the printing of the material, you have the shipping of the material. What's the biggest lever right now? Is it water? Is it dye? Is it the actual sourcing of the raw material? What's the one that you guys have found is the most impactful as far as low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, and I think that it's a great question for us. If you were to gamify your environmental work, you would go right to the biggest impact, right? Dollars in, units of carbon, water, chemistry out. Like, you would want your return on investment to be that this is the smartest, wisest investment, lowest cost, highest yield, right? And that is dependent on the product type too, right? Because if you've got products that are made with a lot of synthetics, you're going to be skewed, which by the way is a lot of it. But there's going to be, you're going to be skewed in different directions than somebody who makes all cotton products or whatever. But the reality is, in the processing and making of stuff, take the raw materials out of it for a minute. It is the wet processing, the dyeing and finishing of fabrics that is the biggest environmental impact. And when we worked on the carbon roadmap to net zero, which is a report we put out with World Resource Institute, it told us that 52% of the CO2 emissions were happening in the mills, not because of the electricity being used, but because of the on site generation of thermal heat to get the water and the temperatures and the steam hot enough to be able to process the fabrics. And traditionally, those are not electric boilers, those are coal burning boilers, maybe natural gas, maybe some other form of material that's being burned. But we're burning something, and that's greenhouse gas equivalents, that's CO2 emissions. And it's also human and environmental health, too, right? It's like air quality and human health. And so that let alone it's the highest volume of water use. It tends to be the highest level of chemical use, which is also human health, environmental health, wastewater treatment, all that. That's that's the big gnarly place to work on. But not to ignore the farm level, not to ignore fossil fossil fuel material, or not fossil fuels, but raw materials coming from petroleum and other minerals, and the extraction of that from the earth. That's clearly a big impact as well too. But we, for the decarbonization work, it is those, we got to eliminate the use of coal across electricity and the grids and on site for thermal heat.
The thermal heat one and just the operation of the dyes and the chemical side is really, I mean, it makes you think about all the clothing that you have, right? You look around and you're like, oh, what, this material, that material, and you like start to just see the world a little bit differently, which I find interesting. On the material side, does that change that process at all? Like when you're seeing a lot of types of materials come out, whether that's, the Allbirds type of approach, you have seaweed, you have you have like oyster shells, you have a bunch of crazy materials coming out, mycelium. Does that change that process at all?
In terms of, yeah, it's interesting. I'm probably not an expert in some of the next generation materials and the processing of those. Is Mainly, I'll tell you why. I mean, when I was at Cradle to Cradle, we were paying a lot more attention to next gen materials. Super cool area. We were doing assessments on a lot of those, and you're seeing a lot of those innovations pop up with Fashion for Good in Amsterdam as part of their incubator accelerator. You're seeing a lot of those next gen materials coming out of Global Change Award at H&M Foundation or Earthshot Prize. So it's the sexier part of the storytelling of fashion and sustainable fashion, but it's still under 1% of the volume of materials. So if AII is the Impact Institute, and we're looking at things that are scale ready and trying to lower the environmental impact of that, our focus is on preferred materials. So we're really looking at recycled content polys and nylons and synthetics, and recycled content cotton as like the big win. And that can be pre-consumer and post-consumer waste. So that loop to circular materials coming from blended fabrics and all that. That's kind of our innovation curve more than it would be some of these materials. So yeah, I'd be hesitant to answer what the chemical usage, dyeing, processing of those are. And it would vary material by material. For me, I think the one that I've paid most attention to is the making of materials from in the man-made cellulosics, so like rayons, and so traditionally some of the biggest manufacturers of those materials are companies like Lenzing, which make Tensol and Modal out of beech wood and other bamboo and other types of materials. But you can make a cellulosic fabric or a rayon type fabric out of any cellulose based material, right? I could take scraps from my house plants, orange peels, mushroom, like any agricultural waste, stalks from pineapples off the pineapple industry, like anything that's a cellulose based material, plant based, can be turned into a rayon like synthetic. So I get excited about the future of displacing synthetic materials coming from petroleum with those materials. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be a massive investment in the scale up of the capacity, because those materials exist. And don't ever let anyone tell you they're not scalable. They're not scalable because nobody's scaling them. If we agreed to scale them, they would scale, because once you can prove they perform, they're functional, they work in the product, and as you said, they're actually achieving. They're really cool fabrics, and textiles and materials are innovative, and they can link up to existing supply chains and solve the problem of one feeding into the other. Once you can make that agreement, again, capitalism scales. You just let the markets take over because you create the demand for them and you build that up. So I did not answering your question around the environmental impact of the processing of those materials and the dyeing and finishing of them, but I also do want to make a plug for, we can scale anything we agree to scale and lower the cost of it ultimately in the process.
No, I think that's might be more of an interesting answer to me, is the fact that, one, learning also that it's only 1%.
If you look at the grid of existing materials, even silk is I think under 1%. I mean, so you've got high 60%, 67, 70% synthetics, petroleum based products. You got another 20 to 25% cotton. So now you're left with under 10%, under 5%, depending on how you slice it. And that's everything else. That's wool. That's, hemp, which barely shows up. That's silk, that's alpaca. That's, let alone these and we started our conversation talking about the fringe, right? How 50, 60 years ago, all this weird stuff like yoga, breathing, and meditation seemed so way out there. And now you can buy it at Walmart as a package deal to take home and implement, like, hey, these things are going to get there too. And maybe in our lifetime, we'll see them creep up into higher percentages of preferred materials, because next generation materials today are tomorrow's preferred materials. And so we lean into preferred materials being lower carbon, environmentally friendly cotton and poly, but those are going to get displaced by these new materials too. They'll come in and they'll be the next generation preferred material.
Mm. I find that really interesting because when you start to look at something at scale over a long period of time, it can become the norm. And I think one of the big challenges, I think, in sustainability just in general, is the ability to be open to so many different solutions. I think that we attach to one solution and we're like, that's the solution, and we just go after that one thing. But right now, I think we're living through really the most exciting time ever in history across the board, whether that's technology, materials, manufacturing, shipping, anything. We have almost anything is possible. We just have to be able to want to do it and explore it and fail a few times at it and find the thing that actually works. Um, is that part of what you guys kind of put into your business model, the ability to try?
Yeah, it is. And I appreciate you saying that, particularly as we have raised this fashion climate fund and have already started deploying funds into our climate solutions portfolio, which is, when we were conceptualizing this, I was thinking, this is like, I want to walk into a supplier or a brand retailer and say, you don't have to, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no one way. In fact, there's just going to be so many ways, and you need to be scaling what's ready to scale while you're developing what's early stage at the same time. You got to do it all in some, but you get to choose your own adventure. Like, don't let me tell you what to take on in order to achieve your goals. You can take on whatever you want, but what you need is access to a portfolio of solutions, and that needs to be across materials, and that needs to be across processes, right? And the equipment related to both, et cetera. And so that was our goal, was that we should ideally find things that we can get to scale, because AII's model is to scale impact, right? And so we believe there are other better and good collaborative partners in the space of developing the early stage, like Fashion for Good, programs like the Accelerator at Global Change Award. There's others that are out there, Plug and Play. There's a number of organizations that are doing great stuff, and we see them as partners to our work because they're the early stage. And when it gets to a certain point where it's been piloted and proven, whether it's a waterless dyeing system or whether it's a dry processing technology or a next gen material, when it gets to a place where it's like proven, has the data, it works, we're ready to model it out in more facilities to demonstrate, hey, it worked in footwear, but does it work in apparel? Or it worked in luxury, but does it work in, more mainstream high street product? And so as we start to look at that, that's where I think AII can start to show up, is to say it's working, and now let's carry it into case studies that demonstrate that it works in other applications in order to get it to the full scale phase. And some things have already been modeled out to show that it works in a bunch of areas, but it's ready for scale phase. But the thing is, there's kind of two categories. There's that which is proven to scale, but not yet scaled. And then there's that which is in the innovation gap, which is we don't yet know, or we're trying to figure it out, and we just get a test. We got to try. And some of that may look like pilots, but some of it may have already been piloted, but now it's like, let's prove that it can get to scale phase. That's where I think AII's model is most beneficial to the sector at large, is to participate in that. Like, we're stuck in pilot phase, how do we get this to scale? And that we can assemble all the right partners around the value chain to really design think someone into scale. But if something's in the innovation gap, it may not have yet the right data. And so it was always in our philosophy with the climate solutions portfolio and the grant making dollars we would apply to attract and promote and give the resources necessary for that material, process, technology, or innovator or innovation, to go to the next level. We would also want to put them in the portfolio and work with them to make sure they have the right data points, around their sustainability. It's proven, it's verified in terms of lowering carbon in this case. Um, and it functions, and it can be financed, right? And so we don't want to kick anybody to the curb if they don't have all those pieces figured out yet. So while we've raised a good bit of money, we're not unlimited. So we have to be specific and pick the ones that we think are most likely to get to scale. But within that, we want to encourage things that maybe we're not putting grant making or subsidy dollars to, but that work and are ready for scale. We want to encourage them to be in our portfolio. So we've now made the decision to open the portfolio up to other solutions that maybe we're not necessarily grant making for, but we've evaluated to say they are scalable, and really encourage some of the earlier stage things to continue to iterate and get to a point where they're ready for us. And the more clear we can get on how to guide them or provide the resources to them to get there, is it behooves us and the rest of the industry to do that. Um, and then I'll say on that front, the ability for us to evaluate these solutions is really around three different criteria, which is it effective in reaching its target? In this case, lower carbon, reducing carbon emissions, and water and chemistry. And like we care about all the environmental KPIs, but we're leading the fund with following the carbon out the door. And so then, yeah, is it effective? And can we prove that? Two, does it have reach or the potential for reach? And so if you look at like precision development was one of the technologies around lowering fertilizer on cotton farms. It had been proven already in food and ag. It's a system that works. Now they want to do it in cotton, and they've tested it and it works in cotton. So they're ready for us to help scale it. So what is the potential reach of this? Every cotton farm in the world. So there's a huge reach, right? That would have huge impact. So it's not just some niche little thing that only fits 5% of manufacturing. This is like it. So that's reach. And then the last one is ability to scale and scalability. And that's going to have a lot to do with other factors related to cost, related to function, related to adoption of the market in general. And sometimes there's drivers in there we're going to have to help try to pull or address. But we want to know that not only does it have a potential for huge reach, but that it actually can be scaled. And some of these earlier things, we haven't answered that question yet. So they may not be ready for us yet.
When you look back on your career, one, do you see the world differently now? I mean, now that you have like such an understanding around almost how, I mean, yes, it's a little bit more on like the apparel fashion industry, but I mean, you see it from the inside out. I mean, it's almost like I can't see films the way a normal person would see a film. Do you see the world differently from one? And then two, how has that kind of affected your worldview of just sustainability in general?
Well, great question. So the deeper I get into it, it's almost like Plato's cave, if you're familiar with that analogy. It's like once you start to come out of the cave and see the light, because before you just were seeing the shadows, so you thought the whole world was actually just the casting of your own shadow on the wall. But as you start to emerge from the cave, Plato wrote about this in the Republic. You start to go, oh, there's a whole big world out there and a sun and trees and beasts. Like I had no idea. You really can't go back into the cave. And Plato's cave, not Cato's place, but that would be interesting. Plato's cave talks about like the desire to go back into the cave versus leave the cave. And I feel like once you're kind of it's hard to see anything differently, but it's a layering, right? Like tomorrow you have this same conversation with me, and I'm going to know five other things that I didn't know in this conversation, and they could be as simple like my brain's taking it in all the time, right? They could be as simple as like something I observe on the street that I don't even realize that's colored who I am as a human and the way I look at things. But with this work, I see the big system, and it's hard to extract one thing. That's why I'm always careful to go, yes, carbon is leading a lot of this decarbonization work because it's going to have immediate impact on staying under 2.0 degrees Celsius. What needs to be under that, not 1.5 degrees change. But as we start to look at um, other externalities that are interconnected. And I think for me, what it also helps shape is from whatever position that I and my team and our AII philosophy can take to ensure that we're not just solving for one problem, but that we're looking at the total system. And as we're going into a country, into one industry's supply chain, which takes us into industrial parks and regions that have other production facilities, that have workers that walk down the road to their homes, that don't have stable power, like it's all connected. The air quality, the human health, it's all about creating resilient, equitable, fair communities, around the world, not just to make our clothes, but to actually thrive and live on this planet. And I think that's where my perception of all of this has changed so much over time, as I can't just see one thing, which is both a blessing and also the little bit of a curse. Because if you have blinders on, at least you're just focused on the one thing. And I'll say AII is focused on lowering carbon in the supply chain, and yet as we reach out to communities and start to solve for problems, I want to encourage anyone who's hearing this podcast or listening, or watching this, that if they're playing, funding, investing, building solutions for some of the externalities that touch and butt up against the work we're doing, I'd love to join forces, and say, how do we solve for a holistic solution in that community? We'll bring in the the employers, and help to bring resilience and decarbonization and stabilize the the future proofing of that textile production in that community or region, from our perspective. But are you working in electronics, and are they in the same region? Are you working in food safety, and that has impacts on biomass, which could be fueling the boilers? Like, there's a lot of connection points, and to me that's exciting. And it provides a lot of opportunity if we really start thinking about joining some of these work streams together and not just trying to solve for one piece at a time.
How do you try and reset, like yourself? I mean, I think one of the big challenges I think that a lot of people miss is when you're head of a company or a founder of a startup, or you deal with a big organization of people. You almost, I mean, everybody expects it to be that kind of thing where you're just on a beach having a good time, and the company's running and you're making millions, you're on yachts flying all over the world. And it's like, that's 100% the opposite of usually what it is. How do you reset yourself in that? Because obviously you have to deal with a lot of stress. You deal with a lot of fires every single day that just kind of like randomly come up. What's your process for kind of trying to find that center?
What a great question. And I think that, all signs are pointing towards more things like Esalen or retreats related to that in order to restore, but a lot of it can be done in my own living room, right? Like, am I doing a good enough job of quieting myself, of not jumping on the computer first thing in the morning, but maybe doing a little reading, a little prayer and meditation, a little, quiet time? Do I end my day with screen time to like numb out, or do I actually, spend that as quiet time for reflection and thinking? I don't always do a great job of it. I tend to think that sleep and exercise and diet are like the number. If you can just keep all those consistently healthy, along the way, then you don't ever go off the rails too badly. But I'm just coming off 6 weeks of travel, where I came home for 3 days to see my kids before, around the Thanksgiving holiday, to depart out again for another 3 weeks. So it was like three weeks out, 3 days, and 3 weeks out. And it's a challenge because you can lose your center pretty quickly and become ungrounded when you're not in a routine, when everything's changing constantly. But through technology, I can keep running the show wherever I am. Have iPhone and iPad will travel, and Wi-Fi and Zoom and all these other tech tools. But for me, it's really critical that I stay plugged into whatever community it is that I've established, and I have a couple that keep me grounded. Those are individual relationships. Those are also communities of fellowship that I'm in, and I think those are key. And also, The ability to realize that, yes, this is really serious and don't take it so seriously, that I can burn myself out fast if not only I think it's so important that I become self-important, and have a sense of humor around the stuff that comes at you, and that keeps me from having to reset too much because I can remind myself, I have a good friend. I'll say, I can remind myself who blanking cares, who effing cares, and it's all going to be okay. Because whenever something comes at me, if I can keep the humor enough to go, like it seems really serious when I read it, but then I have the humility and the humor to go, you know what, who effing cares, and then go, you know why? Because it's all going to be okay. Even some of this big, hairy, audacious stuff we're trying to solve on the planet, it may not be the outcome we want, and it may not be the outcome that we think, but I believe in the resilience of not only humanity, but this planet in a way that, maybe it's all going to be okay. And I choose to believe in that. So it's also about attitude, optimism, and abundance rather than fear, scarcity, and yeah, I mean that's an attitude that helps me not also feel a little bit too freaked out all the time.
Yeah. Very, very easy to do in this industry. I will say that. That's one of the things we try and focus on at Goat is really come from a place of positivity, the excitement around the innovation. It's not so much, hey, the world's ending. Oh my gosh, fear, panic, and craziness.
Yeah. I mean, I said the other day, like, if we didn't have this rising temperature thing to worry about, like, this would be the coolest, most exciting time in the world. But it is this rising temperature thing and this urgency that is creating all of the fast paced work. And it is accelerating. It is the most interesting time to be doing the things we're doing. I'm excited for my kids to get out into the professional world because that's so exciting. The innovative creativity. Will we meet the end? Will we beat the race against the clock of the planet? Like to be determined. Stay tuned. Come back next week. But yeah, it's a really cool time to be working.
Yeah. And where's your favorite place to enjoy nature? I mean, you've been traveling a bunch, but in the whole planet, where's your favorite place to enjoy nature?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question. Well, I mentioned Big Sur, is a really cool place, but I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and about 40 minutes from the house I grew up in is a little cottage that my great grandparents built, and my grandfather and his siblings back in the 1930s. And so we're coming up on 100 years, and we all go down there as a family, and we're all on top of each other because it's not big, but it's right on the water, and it's private in the sense that there's little cottages around it, but there's no condos, there's no restaurants, there's no whatever. And you can walk the beach pretty quietly. Half the time, you go, there's not a lot of people down, and you can fish and you can swim and you can water ski, and but there's pine trees in the front yard, which is really rare, and there's palmetto all behind the house, and some gnarly scrub oaks that you can see down in the parts of the south that are twining intertwining down these little dirt roads that take you up to the water, and it's special, and it's a connection and a place and a piece of earth that I've had a connection to for all my life, as did my father, his father, and his father. And that feels really special. It feels kind of timeless. And my kids and their cousins will have it next. And those are the things I like to think about at the end of the day with all this chaos and all that. As bad as it gets, maybe I just sit down on that porch, and take it in. And it's up on a hill. So as the water levels rise, it's got some time. So that's good.
That's incredible. Well, Lewis, thank you just for taking the time to talk about everything you're doing at Apparel Impact Institute, your leadership, your view of really how to fix systems change. I think it's unique. because it's looking at it holistically. And I think that one of the biggest things, and I guess call this a compliment, but that, the world probably won't know the impact that you have, but everybody will actually experience it. They just may not know that Lewis did it, but I think that what you're doing is hugely impactful.
Thank you. Well, 10 years ago, I would have wanted probably more credit, but today I'm like, it's like, it's fun when people acknowledge, how hard you're working. But at the end of the day, that's cool with me if I'm in the background. There's other environmental luminaries who can have books and chapters about themselves and all that.
Thank you so much for listening to the GOAT podcast. You are the reason why we exist and why we show up every single day.
I've spent too many years being against stuff, and I've found now that it's a little bit easier and a little bit more fun to be for something.
How are we going to power the world? How are we going to build the world? How are we going to feed the world?
Company isn't just good or bad, black or white. Usually there's a lot more there, a lot more that they don't know.
It's actually about what you do in your daily life every day can make a huge difference.
Give this episode a share. Join our GOAT community, but most importantly, go spend some time in nature because you might find it a meaningful reminder of the amazing place that we get to call home. I'm Steve Cassingham, and we'll see you next time.